All right, we'll get started. Okay, so today's lecture will be on a new topic again. The assignment 2 will be related to this topic. And I'll give it to you next week, maybe sometime before. So specifically in the assignment, you'll do what's called a cognitive walkthrough. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the theory of what we're doing, and it will include this methodology, which is called a cognitive walkthrough. Next class, what we'll do is I'll do a cognitive walkthrough myself. Well, we'll do it together as a class. We'll do it on a piece of software called Tor, which is a browser. That gives you some privacy. And then you'll be, in the assignment, you'll also do one as well. But the one that you do in the assignment won't be on Tor, it will be on something else. So in the past, we've had you analyze things that are related to managing cookies in browsers. And so it seems to go pretty well, so I might just have you do that, but I'll have a conversation with the TA and see if we are going to change it this year or if we'll do it the same way. Okay, is there any questions about anything before we start? About the last lectures or about anything else? Okay, so as I mentioned last class, the exam date is posted, so you can check that out. And yeah, I think that's it. By the way, did you like the idea of having videos recorded and then just coming for a question and answer, or do you prefer it like sort of in-person class? I ask it because at Concordia, we do have the option to teach a course, we call it blended, which is exactly that. It's like pre-recorded lectures. So my blockchain course I teach, that's the format that we teach. The positives that I see, pre-recorded, you can do it on your own time, whenever you want. The big drawback is if you're not coming to class, you might wait till before the exam and try and watch 10 lectures at once, and then you're not going to absorb the material. But I'm curious if anyone has any opinions, whether you like that, what we did the last 2 weeks, better or worse. So one vote in person. In person? Okay, so no one likes the blended option. All right. I won't suggest to our department that we turn this into a blended course then. Be warned though, if you do take my blockchain course, it is all the lectures are pre-recorded, and then it's just question and answer. That's the in-person component. Okay, so today we're going to talk about usability. So usability is something you've seen before. You saw the evaluation framework. Usability was one of the things. In assignment 1, you had to come up with some usability criteria, so you sort of know what they are. In assignment 1, you came up with the usability criteria, and then you decided whether the ticketing system met or did not meet your usability criteria. Okay, so you just sat there and decided for yourself. In real life, you can't do that. Like, you can't just sit there and just make up, like, yeah, this is good or this is bad. What you should do is follow some sort of methodology for determining at a more scientific level whether it's true or not. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover in this lecture is what are the techniques that you'll use. I'll show you 3 of them, and then one of them I'll have you actually use during the assignment 2. Okay, so usability is one of these things that kind of falls through the cracks, just like social engineering. It's not like a technical subject, right? So you take the other core security courses here, you're going to learn about network security and cryptography and operating system security, software security. Those are like core technical topics, very easy to teach. But just like social engineering, usability is important. Its importance is sort of outsizes like how often it's taught in a course, right? So like with social engineering, it's like one of the most prevalent kinds of attacks, yet it's one of the ones that's taught the least because it's not technical. So usability is sort of the same way. If you have a security product or a solution, and let's say it's great on security, it absolutely is better than the status quo in terms of the security of it, but it's hard to use, then no one's going to use it. Okay, or they're not going to want to use it. The users will try to avoid using it. They'll do whatever they can to basically not use it. Okay, and so you want to get the usability right. If you don't get the usability right, especially if you have a choice. I mean, it's one thing if Concordia turns on two-factor authentication, you're kind of stuck using it, right? But a lot of things are things that you choose to use. You don't have to use it. You don't have to have an antivirus on your computer. It's up to you, right? And so if these things aren't usable, you're going to choose not to actually do them, even if they're secure. When you have bad usability, so users will avoid it. They'll make errors and mistakes. And sometimes the errors can lead to security consequences that are worse than if they just never tried to mess around with the tool in the first place. And so avoiding it, they might look for alternatives. The alternatives might be less secure as a result. Another thing is that security is never what users want to do. It's not their primary goal, right? Users want to do something. They want to connect to the internet. They want to go to a website. They want to put their password in so they can log in. Their security is something they're conscious of. So we think about security, but we don't sit down and say, today I want to be really secure. I want to use my computer in a secure way. That's not the primary goal, right? You want to do things with your computer. And of course, if you can do it in a secure way, that's okay. But it's always this sort of secondary, at best, it's a sort of secondary notion. It's not your primary goal. Another kind of thing that comes up a lot in usability is you can warn users. So we saw this with SSL. So for example, let's say that we saw that a lot of websites won't, when you go to a lot of websites, whether or not the certificate that's used is revoked won't be checked by your browser, okay? And the reason it's not checked by your browser is because you would get warnings all the time, right? You go to, you get 1 million warnings a day, and then the warning is just not that useful. You're just going to swat it away. It's going to annoy you. You're not going to pay attention to it. And so there's this idea that users fatigue if you try to warn them too much or if you throw a lot of errors whenever there's a security issue. Okay, so you want to try and handle the security issues without having the user in the loop, or you want to only loop the user in when it's absolutely critical. So security works best when it's just sort of in the background, it's automated. You're not asking the user, do you trust this certificate? Oh, it's expired. Are you sure you trust it? I don't know whether it's revoked or not. The server's down. What do you want to do? Right? If you keep asking the user, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? Then it's going to fatigue the user. They're not going to make good choices. They're not experts anyways. They don't even know what they're deciding to do. Because it's a secondary goal, they're just going to kind of click through whatever you throw at them just to get the computer to do what they want it to do. So what we like on the positive side from usability is we like software that tries to get the users to do the right thing. So instead of warning them or fatiguing them, it sort of guides them in the right direction. It kind of nudges them towards the behavior that you would want, which is secure behavior. And then another just sort of high-level principle is a lot of people, a lot of companies, particularly if we're thinking of software. So I should note as a high-level point, I'm going to talk a lot about software, but usability is not just a software thing. Software is the most frequent thing that you look at, but it could be hardware, it could be a procedure, it could be anything. So it doesn't have to be limited to software. But anyways, if you go to the people who made the software, the developers, and ask them, is this usable? They're going to tell you yes, because in their minds it makes sense, right? It had to make sense because they couldn't have developed it if it didn't make sense, right? So to them, everything is perfectly clear, but you have to remember they're not your normal user, right? They're an expert user. They have extra knowledge, whether they know it or not, or they're conscious of it or not. And something that developers think works good, you give it to the general population, it might not work so good, right? So you need to sort of not just take the developer's word or the expert's word for it. You have to try and do something to establish whether something's usable or not, beyond just developers telling you it is. Another kind of high-level principle is that defaults are really important. Yeah.
So the developer is more secure user than the normal user.
Sorry, these slides are kind of weird. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
So the developer is more secure user than the normal user.
Yeah, because they understand what the software is doing and what's not. So they'll make better decisions, which is secure decisions as well. Yeah. So they'll behave in a way that's more secure because they understand the consequences of what they're deciding. Yeah. Okay, another thing is software often comes with a set of defaults, and the defaults are put there by the developers, right? So the defaults are there because there's actually a setting that you could change. So you could choose to do A or you could choose to do B. And then the developer says, I think most users would want A instead of B. So that's like an implicit decision that's integrated in the software itself. And that's one area where you can really tweak people's behaviors, is by looking at what the defaults are, because a lot of people don't change the defaults. They just go with the defaults. And then another kind of high-level principle is that the way that the user understands what's going on is called their mental model. Okay, so a user has a mental model of what's happening. Okay, and the mental model and what's actually happening in practice are not always exactly the same. Okay, they could be different, and that's okay. Okay, so the idea isn't, you're not trying to teach the user all the background details that they need. You're trying to give them enough useful information so that they can figure out what to do, even if the information isn't exactly correct. Okay, so I have some examples of this stuff in a second.
Excuse me, Professor,
Yeah.
the graph is about the last graph that you showed.
This?
This is about how good with the default are the users?
Sorry, this graph here?
Yes.
Oh, I haven't got here yet. Sorry, I just flipped around. Yeah, I'll explain this in a second. Yeah. Okay. All right, so this is an example of why defaults matter. Okay, so what the graph is, and this has nothing to do with security. I picked an example that has nothing to do with security just so that you get the general concept. So what this is a graph that shows you a bunch of different countries, and it shows you what percentage of people will donate their organs if they, say, get in a car accident and they die. Okay, so it's kind of a dreadful thought, but anyways, that's what the data shows. Okay, and what's sort of unusual about this graph is if you look at the blue lines, you have near 100% compliance. Okay, so Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, they all have like upward of 85% of people who agree to donate organs. Okay, if you go to Denmark, Netherlands, UK, Germany, you have a very low percentage, like under 25% generally across the board. Okay, so you could look at this data and you could think, well, what's the difference? Is Germany and Austria really that different? I mean, they're both sort of they're both European countries. Lots of Germans live in Austria. Lots of Germans live in Germany. Like, are they really that much different than that 12% of people would donate organs in Germany, but 99.98% would in Austria? And so the answer is, the hint is defaults. Whoops. So defaults matter. So the difference between these countries, it's not that the people are different or the culture's different or anything like that, probably. Probably it just comes down to the simple fact that in Germany, by default, you do not donate your organs. And if you want to donate your organs, you can, but you have to fill out a piece of paper that says you're willing to do it when you get your driver's license, usually. Okay? Austria is the exact flip. So in Austria, by default, you're donating your organs. You don't have to. If you don't want to, it's fine, but you got to fill out a piece of paper that says, I don't want to do it. Then you don't have to do it. Okay? So both of the countries give you the option, yes, you can do it, no, you can't do it. The difference is which is the default, right? So the default is turned on for organ donation in Austria, and it's turned off for Germany, and it makes this huge difference, right? So anyway, there was a bunch of research. There's a book called Nudge that became kind of famous in political science circles because they said basically if Germany flipped their defaults, right, they're not taking any freedom away from people. People are still free to choose whatever they want. But if you just flip the default, you can have this huge social impact. Okay? And then there's a lot of other things like that in society where you can do it. And some governments had, like, they called them nudge departments, where they would go through all the public policy defaults and try and look for things that they could change to nudge the right behavior. So security is kind of like this with software as well. Okay, so the software defaults could nudge you in the right direction without taking your freedom away. So you still have a setting where you can change it if you want to change it, but the default matters. The other thing I mentioned is mental models. So mental models is how you think the system works, and you have to understand the system at some level in order to use it. And then there's the way that it actually works. And sometimes it's convenient to give a mental model that's not actually correct. Okay? So an example would be, here's a steering wheel. I'm sure most of you have driven a car, or at least pretend at an arcade or something like that. What happens if I turn the wheel to the right? Okay, so the car will go to the right. Why does the car go to the right when I turn it to the right? Okay. Well, at least it has to do with the tires, right? So the tires are turning to the right. Okay? So that's a pretty simple mental model, right? The steering wheel is connected to the tires. If I turn it to the right, the tires go to the right. If I turn it to the left, the tires go to the left. Okay? So here's a question. Is it possible to turn the steering wheel to the right and have the tires go to the left? Okay, why? That's not right, is it? How's that possible? No, like not changing your car. So yeah, you could change your car to do it, right? But a default car, I just bought this car, it's off the lot. I didn't make any changes to it, right? Every time I turn the steering wheel to the right, the tires are going to go to the right. They'll never go to the left without changing the car. Now people think that's correct. I convinced you. So the truth is, no, it's not actually correct. You're right in your original. So there's certain scenarios, like you have a traction control system. And so in a traction control system, you don't have traction on some of your tires. And sometimes you want to turn into the skid to regain traction and then pull it back out. Okay? So what the car understands is when the user goes like this, moving it to the right, they want the car to go to the right. And if that means that I have to turn the tire slightly to the left to regain traction and then crank it to the right once I have traction, then the car is going to do that. Okay? So anyway, this is an example where my mental model is fine. If I think turning to the right makes the car go to the right, or the tires go to the right, that's okay. I don't have to know that the traction control would sometimes override it, right? I would think that it's mechanically connected, right? Like the steering wheel, like somehow, like physically, like a gear is like turning the wheels. But really in modern cars, it's like a computer interface, right? You turn it to the right, and it's just a computer says, oh, the car wants to go to the right. And then the computer tells the computer at the wheels, go to the right. And then there's some like motors or actuators that would actually like make it move. Okay. So anyways, the point is that a lot of the complexity can be hidden, and that's a good thing. Okay. So we're not here. You don't have to understand how a car works to use a car. Okay. So security software should be the same. You don't have to understand encryption in order to encrypt your traffic, right? You shouldn't have to understand network malware and intrusion detection systems and all that stuff to, have something on your computer that's going to try and protect you from that. But you do have to understand at a high level. Okay, so a mental model is an abstraction that's sort of enough detail that you can do the right thing, but not enough detail that you would have a perfect technical, accurate understanding of how it works. Okay, so let's say I come to you with something, let's say it's software, and I say, is this usable or not? And that's your job. What are you going to do? All right, so it turns out that there's a couple different ways you can do it. There's actually lots. There's probably an infinite way ways of doing it. But in general, most things that people use fall into 3 categories. Okay, so the first category is what we call expert review. And in this case, you're going to have someone that's an expert in the usability side. They're going to look at the thing and they're going to try and apply some methodology to figuring out whether it's usable or not. And we'll go through what that methodology looks like. Another thing you can do is if you care whether users can use it or not, why don't you just get a bunch of users, put them in a room and see if they can use it or not. Okay, so that's called a user study. So that's fine. Generally with a user study, a typical user study might be 30 minutes to 1 hour with each user. And because some users will know more or less, you want to have kind of an average opinion. So you need to have enough users to sort of average out any differences in your user group. So around 20 users would be enough to start averaging out differences. You could go up to 100 or 200 kind of users if you were measuring something that's very subtle, which I'll detail in a few slides. And then the further sort of extreme is you could do what's called a field study. So a field study is that you actually sort of deploy it live with the actual people that are using the software. So software might do this, like say Twitter wants to change their interface or X or whatever it is now. They might say, okay, we're going to take half our users, we'll give them the new interface. And so now you have hundreds of thousands of people that are using the new interface. So that would be a field study. Or a company might just say, okay, we're gonna do a trial with this, so we'll give it to everyone, and then in 2 weeks we'll ask you a bunch of questions about how it went, and then maybe we go back or maybe we keep it. So anyway, field study, you usually it's usually over 20, but it's usually like hundreds or thousands or even more users, and they tend to use the system. It's not like a 1 hour study. They're going to use it for a day, a week, a month kind of thing, and then you're going to get a stronger kind of opinion about how the software works. Okay, so I'll go through them one by one. So expert review, user study, field study. I should say that a field study is the best. You can probably see it already. Like, why wouldn't you just do a field study? And the answer is it's expensive. Okay, so you can think of it. This is sort of an ordering of these. So the top to bottom is sort of the easiest to do to the hardest to do. So the easiest to do would be just get one expert to look at it. User studies are kind of complicated. Field studies are very complicated. But then the quality of the product, like how confident are you with the end result that this is actually usable if the study is telling you it's usable, you would have more confidence if 100,000 people use it than if one expert said it. Okay, so as you go down the chart, you become more confident. It's sort of a better methodology, but it's also a harder to do and more expensive. Okay, so expert review is conducted by generally one expert, but it could be a small number. You might have 2 or 3 experts. You might do an agreement amongst them so that you only consider things that 2 of the 3 agreed on, that type of thing. And expert here are, what are they experts in? And so usually what you want for this type of thing is what we call a dual expert. So a dual expert has 2 expertise. One expertise is in usability. So they understand what the process is that they're using. They understand the methodology. And then the other is you want them to actually understand the system that they're evaluating. So if they're evaluating a security system, they have a proper mental model, not like an abstraction. They actually know all of the details. And then this helps them see corner cases or scenarios that normal users would sort of fall into, okay? So they're not going to evaluate the system from the position of being an expert. They're going to think like a normal user to the extent that they're able to, okay? But they do have that actual knowledge, so they do understand what's going on. So they understand, for example, if a user clicks on this, they know immediately what's the consequence of actually clicking on that. Is it, yeah. So anyway, dual experts. So they have some expertise in the process of evaluating the usability of something, and then they understand the tool that's being studied itself. And there's different kinds of expert reviews. In particular, I can't remember if I cover this. Yeah, okay. So one type of expert review is called a cognitive walkthrough. And so this is the one that you'll do in the assignment. So you're going to become a dual expert to the extent that you can. You're going to learn what the methodology is, and then you'll learn a bit about what you're going to study, and then you'll actually do the process itself. So cognitive walkthrough is a kind of expert review. It's one of many. The main difference between it and the other types of expert reviews is it focuses on completing tasks. So what you do is you actually establish a set of tasks that a normal user would want to do with the software, and then that's kind of where you start with your usability analysis, okay? Another kind of expert review that's popular is called heuristic evaluation. Heuristic evaluation would be more like you open the software and you see there's 5 menus. There's file, there's edit, and then you go through the menu one by one and you say, okay, file, what's the first option? What does that do? What's the second option? What does that do? What's the third option? And then you look at the user interface and you see there's 30 buttons across the top. What does the first button do? What does the second button do? What happens when you press the third button? So heuristic evaluation is very much like user interface driven, and it's just sort of like you document every single piece of user interface, okay? So manuals, like, I don't know if you remember this, but software used to come with like a book that would tell you how to use the software. It's called a manual. And so manuals, some things still do, like your car comes with a manual. And it's sort of oriented more around the heuristic evaluation, right? It will say you have a dashboard and there's a bunch of lights, and this is what this light means. If you see this light, it means this, blah, 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 right? But now car manuals are actually becoming more task-oriented. It's like, okay, you have a flat tire, what do you do? Step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. Step 3, you do this. So that's sort of the difference between the two. But anyways, eventually those sort of converge, right? You'll do enough tasks that you'll touch the entire user interface, and so you'll kind of end up in the same place, whichever approach you use. Okay, so I give this exact example. So a car manual would explain what every button does versus a car manual that explains step by step how to do something. So what the expert does in this case is they are an expert. So before I said, remember, dev not equal user, right? Here it's sort of contradicting that, because now you're having someone that has dev-like knowledge and you're having them do the usability, okay? But the difference here, the reason you can have both statements be true is the expert here is purposely not being an expert, okay? They're not saying it's a usable because I'm an expert. They're thinking like someone else. So they're role-playing the idea of a user that does not have their expertise. Now, the degree that you can do this, right, that, you can't say anything about it. It's hard for humans to like pretend they don't know things that they already know. But anyways, this is what a cognitive walkthrough calls for, is for a user, or for the expert reviewer to sort of do this, okay? Now, normally they would pick like what a normal user would be, but that's not necessarily the case. So like not all software is targeted at a normal user. Some software, like say it's an IDE for developing and you have some static analysis tools that are built in and you want to figure out how good they are, then you want to think like a developer, right? So basically they're going to pick the kind of user they want to emulate and they'll try and role play that user. So it could be a normal user, it could be a user, more of an expert user. It could be like a child, for example, if it's children's software. Like there's different kinds of users that you might emulate that are special cases. And you might not just pick one. You might say, okay, I want to do the software evaluation or the usability evaluation as an expert. This is sort of what I think. Here's what a normal user would think. It might be a little different. Here's what another kind of user would think. And so you might do it. And even in the evaluation itself, you can say, at this stage, some kinds of users might do X and some kinds of users might do Y. So you can kind of fork your evaluation as you're doing it. Okay, so the basic idea of a cognitive walkthrough is the expert says, okay, someone wants to use this software. What do they actually want to do with the software? Like what's the core task that they want to accomplish, right? So if it's a word processor, it might be like, okay, they want to write a letter with it and then they want to print it, right? So writing it would be a core task, printing it would be a core task, saving it to a file would be a core task. And so what you do is you just establish what the core tasks are, And then these are what you're going to evaluate. And the number of core tasks you evaluate just depends on how complete you want to be. Okay? So you definitely start with the most basic ones, the ones that most users will want to do first. And then you go as far as you want. You could look at 10 tasks. You could look at 1,000 tasks. You know, it depends on how thorough you're trying to be. Then what you do is you basically put yourself, so you go back to role playing. So you're like, okay, I'm a normal user now, and my core task is to save this file. How am I going to do it? And then you actually walk through that process. So you actually save it yourself, okay? And then as you're doing the process, you're asking yourself, okay, what would a normal user do? Like, it's showing me this dialogue, like what would they click on? And if they click on this, what happens? Or if they think this, what happens? And so basically you just walk through the core task yourself. You sort of give a commentary on what the user's seeing, what you think a normal user would do. And by normal user, I mean the user that you're trying to emulate, which might not be normal. And then what you also have is you have a set of guidelines, and the guidelines try to tell you how the software should be, basically. Like what, if it is usable, what should it do that would make it to be usable, okay? And so it just gives you kind of a set of things that you can think about, criteria that you can think about as you're walking through. So guidelines are they're always positively phrased, meaning that you want to have them. And they're meant to say like that the system is usable at some level. So an example of a guideline would be the interface, meaning the software interface, it guides the user. So you could say, okay, I want to do this task with the software. I don't know where to start. How's the software guiding me? Like, does it have icons? Do the icons have names? Do the names mean something to me? If I kind of hover my mouse over a button that I think is going to do the task, does it give like a helpful tip about what it's for? The icon that they choose to represent it, the graphic that they use, is that the right graphic to communicate to me that I should be clicking on this button? And conversely, like all the buttons that are the wrong ones, I shouldn't click on them. They're not going to help me do my tasks. So these are the kinds of things that you would do. You might say, is the language easy to understand? So like in SSL, we saw that there were some warnings, right? Like warnings about certificates and things like that. And we saw that the original browsers, like browsers 15 years ago or longer, they had language that was hard to understand. A normal user couldn't understand because it talks about certificates and servers and a bunch of, gobbledygook. But now it's like they're very direct, right? They just sort of tell you, you might be at risk, and they try to explain it to you in language that you can understand while giving you a good mental model of what's going on. So then you would say, okay, that uses easy to use language, okay? So for the assignment, I'm going to give you the guidelines. So I'll give you what they are. You won't have to invent your own guidelines, but you will come up with your own core tasks and you'll do the actual process. And as I mentioned, next lecture, I'm going to do it as well. So you'll see it, next lecture, you'll see an actual cognitive walkthrough, and then and we'll do it, and then you'll do it also for the assignment. Yeah?
It's usability different when you're using a software that you use every day, for example, an accountability software, because in that case, it's key to be able to do your task very fast, even if you know the icons and everything. And other thing is when you download a software and you use for the first time, so it's different.
So there's a huge difference between using the software for the first time and using it for the 20th time. One of the shortcomings of this type of thing is it's hard to tease that out, right? So a difference, that kind of difference, you probably aren't going to get from an expert review unless if the expert is thinking about that deliberately. So maybe yes, maybe no. It becomes more of a problem in a user study where you have an hour with the user, and generally they're using it for the first time. And after that hour, they're done using it, and then you're going to make all your conclusions based on that 1 hour of interaction. That's going to miss all the things that happen when you use the software repeatedly. And then the benefit of a field study, because you can do it for a week or a month, is that those kinds of observations, how things change over time. Does the user fatigue? Or do they get better? Or is there something that you could do in the software that would make it easier for users because it's something that they do a lot? All those kinds of things you can answer in a field study. So that's why they're so valuable, is that you get those sort of long-term insights. Yeah. So and I'll tell you some stories about exactly your question as well. Yeah. Okay. All right, so we'll see some concrete examples next week. You'll see it with Tor, and then in the assignment you'll be able to do it. Okay, so the pros and cons of a cognitive walkthrough as opposed to a user study, as opposed to a field study, is they're fast because you have an expert, so the expert can just sit down and do it. They're relatively cheap. I mean, you have to pay for the expert, but it's probably cheaper. If you do a user study, you're also paying for an expert to run the study, but then you have to pay for all the users on top of it. And the other thing is the expert can spend a week, a month, a year doing a cognitive walkthrough, so it can be as broad as you want. They can look at as many core tasks. They can look at as much of the interface as you want. Whereas a user study, you get people for an hour. There's only so much you can give them to do in an hour. A field study also will give you broad coverage. So the cons of an expert review is basically the expert makes a mistake. And so mistakes are sort of type 1, type 2, or false positive, false negative. There could be a usability issue that's there, and the expert misses it. Okay, so that's the one kind of mistake. And the other kind of mistake is the opposite, which is less likely but still possible, which is there's actually no usability issue there. An average user would not have a problem with using the user interface, but the expert, because they're kind of overanalyzing everything, they think that there's a problem there. So they flag it even though it wouldn't actually be an issue in practice. And then you have to decide if you're going to try and fix it. And you have to sort them out too. Like this is one that's sort of a false positive, and this issue is something that we actually have to fix. So if you get back a big long report that says here's 1,000 things to fix, then you have to try and prioritize the ones that you actually want to fix. Okay, the next is a user study. So a user study is something where you get actual users to come in and use it. Usually people that have no prior relationship to you or your company or to the software. The software is different. They might be users who have used the previous version of the software, or you might try and get new users who have never seen it. It's up to you. Depends on what you're testing exactly. Usually, if you use less than 20 users, your results will be kind of unreliable. There's too much noise and variation across your users. So it's hard to get good results with less than 20. Not a hard and fast rule, but around 20 would be kind of the minimum. And then if you do more than 200, it's just a lot of work. And you're probably not learning anything new after 200 people have gone through. And so, yeah, the sort of upper end of the study would be 200. Exceptions to this would be this is for security software, okay? If you're testing a vaccine, right, then you're going to use more than 200 people or something like that. So if it's some sort of medical thing where you want accuracy down to 99.999%, it's safe or whatever, then you need big user studies. But just for security and software and things like that, you probably aren't going to see many studies that would have more than 200 people. Okay, so what's the process for doing a user study itself? So let's say that we want to do one here. So we're at Concordia. We have my students come up with some software one of you does for the project, the course project. And so you want to do a user study and see if people can actually use it. So the first thing that you have to do in a university setting, it's not always the case in a corporate setting, is you actually have to have the university approve the study before you do it. So anytime you have other humans that come in, they're called subjects, then you have to submit a form. There's a board called the ethics board, and they review all the experiments that people want to do on humans. Usually not a problem with a security study. A medical study or something like that, obviously there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of what you want to do, but you still have to go through the process. So you still have to get ethics. So any study that involves human participants tends to happen in an academic setting. What the thing that you'll submit to the ethics clearance does is it basically just says what you're going to do. I'm going to bring a user in. I'm going to ask them to do this, use this software, and it will just walk through basically the design of your study. And there are two kinds of areas where where there could be ethics issues. Even if you're just studying security software, it's usually pretty low stakes. But there are kind of two issues that you might see. So one is it's very common in a user study to lie to the user about what the study's about. So like, for example, let's say that you want to see how well do people choose passwords. You could just say, you could bring the user in and say, hey, we're running a study. It's about how well you choose a password. So we want you to choose a password. What's the user going to do in that context? They're going to choose a really good password because, they know it's about security. Okay? So what you do is you say, oh, we have a new game and we're just testing it out. So, why don't you go, oh yeah, sorry, it's an online thing. There's this online component, so you have to create a username account. Just whatever, do whatever you want, make a username, make a password, and then we'll play the game. And then they play the game and you ask them a bunch of questions about the game, but actually all you cared about was the password they created. That's the only thing that you were cared about, okay? So that's called deception. Yep.
Is that not subject to his perspective? Because it's not a secure, it's not easy for his own secure account, so he could just put any password just for that game.
Absolutely, yeah. So then you might flip it around and say, well, he or she is going to give like a garbage password because it's just a user study or whatever, right? So then that's where so the example I gave was kind of bad. So you would try to and create a scenario that has that deception, but also triggers the behavior you want, right? So you might say, oh, like, you're going to play this game. I'm going to give you some money at the end. And I'm using this online banking kind of system to give it to you or something like that. So you just create a username and account for that. And then hopefully that's like more of a realistic where they might think, oh, someone might steal my money or something like that. Yeah. So that's something you would incorporate into the design of the study. Okay. So anyways, anytime you deceive a user, the basic rule is that you tell them. So you can deceive them. It's fine. It's ethical. To do the deception, but at the end you have to say, oh, by the way, now that the study's over, it wasn't about the game at all, it was about your password. Okay? Then where it gets controversial, where the ethics people sometimes fight with the academics, is sometimes the user has the option to say, you know what, now that I understand the true nature of the study, I want to drop out. So I don't want you to use my data. And then the academic will say, well, that's going to bias our data. And so then you get into fights, and how it's settled depends basically on like who exactly is on the different committees at that time. But I've heard stories about that type of thing. Another type of thing that pops up, go ahead.
What if the user, after he knows that this is what he wants to do, what if he asks to change his response?
So you don't allow them to change, unless if it's part of the study, you don't let them redo it. So the basic choice is you can always walk away, you can always walk out of the study, but you can't go back and change it unless if it's part of the study itself. Okay. Then the other type of thing concerns data collection. So you're going to collect data like how old are you? What's your educational background, like basic demographics, that kind of thing, your address. So that's the kind of thing that you have to think about, like where are you going to store that? How long are you going to store it for? How's it going to get deleted? Who has access? Like, does your random PhD student have access to that data, right? If someone comes in and they want to contact them later, they shouldn't be able to do that, right? But if you're collecting their phone number and then all of a sudden the student that has access to that file is texting the person or something like that, right, then that's a violation. So the rules of stuff about how you collect the data, who has access, how you delete it, how long you retain it, those are also things that you have to consider. And then in the specific example I did it on purpose, is you actually probably wouldn't be able to get away with the password kind of study that I mentioned, because if I ask you to create a password, there's a chance that you'll use a password that you already use on your other accounts. Okay, and now you haven't really consented to me learning what your password is for other accounts, and so that's the kind of thing that that the ethics people would probably say, oh, you can't do that study because you might inadvertently collect people's real passwords without doing it. You can still try and study that, but just find a different way of doing it so that's not an issue with it. And then, so then the ethics boards reviews everything, and then they either say go ahead or they say change this. And then you might go back and forth with them, and eventually they'll sign off, or you'll give up trying to get clearance. And then when you actually do your study, if you, for example, let's say you publish it as a paper or something, you have to usually say in the paper that it got ethics clearance. Okay, so we got our ethics clearance. Now, by the way, that process can take months. Okay, so if you love this idea of a user study, it's too late to do it for your class project this term. Anyways, you're never going to get through ethics before it's due. So you have to plan ahead. Anyways, okay, so we got our ethics clearance, so we're happy. Now we need actual users for our study. So where do we get them? Do we go on the sidewalk and hand out flyers? Like, how exactly are we going to get a bunch of users to come in? So you might advertise it. Okay, so the main point I want to make here is the way that you get users could influence the results. Okay, so for example, if I put signs all over the university, I'm going to get a lot of students by definition, right? Maybe I don't want a lot of students. Maybe my target user is not a student, right? Or the percentage, the chance that they are a student is roughly equivalent to the general population. Okay, whereas the chance that someone reads an ad that I posted in a university as a student is like 90% or something like that, right? And so my demographic of who my user is and who's doing my study is going to differ, right? So so where you advertise it will have an influence on who participates in your study. Some universities that run a lot of these user studies, they'll have a list of people that have participated in user studies before. And so they'll sort of maintain it, and they'll try and, as new people come in, they'll be like, okay, did this person, like some people will say they show up, but then they never show up and things like that. So they're people that are sort of generally reliable. They've done it before. They know what the process is. They're willing to do it again. And then they also kind of know the demographics of them. So they try to balance it out so that the group as a list looks closer to the general population, as close as you can get it to the general population as possible. Whoops. And then another thing you can do is you may be able to do your user study without having the person sit in a room. Okay. So for example, if they're just testing software, they could be sitting at home testing the software. You don't have to bring them to Concordia to do it necessarily. Okay. And so if your study is such that you could do it remotely, then what you can do is you can go on, there's platforms like Mechanical Turk, which is owned by Amazon now, and there's other ones, and they have a general platform for paying users to do simple tasks, usually tasks that would be like half an hour or an hour to complete, and there's usually a going rate of, it might be like $20 a user or something like that, that you would pay. And then you could get 1,000 people or 2,000 people to actually do your user study. But it has to be fully automated. It has to be something that can be done remotely, that you don't need in-person interaction. And then because people use it so much, there have been academics that have studied, okay, what's the average mTurk user look like? So then there's papers, and so there's a bunch of research on what they look like. And so you can look at the actual demographic as we understand it. You can look at your target demographic, and then you can use statistics to sort of adjust things so that they look the same. Okay, so now we have a bunch of users. So either they're people that are coming into the study, or they're online. It's an online platform. Then what we normally do is we ask them some questions before we do the study. Okay, so we have a questionnaire. All users, potential users. At this point, we haven't actually committed to having them be a user. We say, first you have to do a questionnaire. We're going to look at it, and then we'll call you back if we select you to actually participate. So the main purpose of the questionnaire is to get some basic demographic information. So age, education level, income level, special expertise, like if you have technical knowledge or things like that. These are the kinds of things, if you're evaluating software, that you might ask. You might ask about other stuff as well, but these are probably the ones that are the most relevant. Then what you're going to do is you're going to say, you know what, we have too many young people. So I'm going to stop accepting young people, and if an old person comes, then I'll use them. Or we have too many people that are undergrad students, right? I need a couple like with a PhD, and I need a whole bunch that never went to university. And so I'm going to stop accepting students or like people, like users in this sort of demographic or whatever. So what you'll do is you'll use the demographic information to sort of create a set that tries to match the demographic that you want, which is usually the general population, but it might be something else depending on what your study's about. Okay, the next thing you do is that once you select someone, so usually the questionnaire is like sort of for free, but then if you select someone to actually be involved in it, it's always for money. Okay, you're always compensating someone for their time. Sometimes it's a per user amount, so it's like I'll give you $20 to do this, or I'll give you $100 to do this. And sometimes what people do if they want to be cheap is it's bad to be like I'll give you $1 to do this because most people wouldn't want to do it. But what they might do is they might say, well, we're going to buy an iPad. The iPad's worth $500, and if you participate, we'll put your name in a draw, and one of you will win the iPad or something like that. So that's a sort of indirect way of paying users, usually a smaller amount when you see that type of thing. So the payment is for the time that they're going to spend on the study. Paying them is important because then they feel good about doing the study. They're not sort of begrudgingly doing it. So you want people to just be kind of neutral, like, yeah, I'm here, I'm getting paid for it, it's all good. So now let's just concentrate on the study itself. Whoops. And then the other important thing is that you pay them at the start, and you pay them regardless of whether they complete the study or not. Okay. So this may sound counterintuitive. Why don't you pay them at the end? If someone drops out halfway, you really want to pay them. And the answer is, if you don't do it that way, it could bias your results. So someone that's sitting halfway through the study, they don't care what's going on. They just want to get out of there. But if you're like, I'm only paying you if you complete it, what are they going to do? They're going to sit there and complete the study just to get paid, right? But they're not going to do a good job. They don't care about it. If you ask them questions, they'll just be like, yeah, or whatever, right? And so you could bias the results. So if you want your results to be unbiased, it's better to just pay people if they want to leave. You drop them from the study, so they won't be you won't use their data, and that's fine. They're free to use. They're free to leave. Okay, so you're not holding someone there kind of hostage about whether they get paid or not. Everyone's there freely. And they're only there because they want to participate. Okay, so that's sort of that's sort of what you want. And usually, from experience, people don't take advantage of this. They don't sign up for it and then leave. Get paid and then leave. Okay, then what you want to do is you want to do the actual study itself. So studies need to be. There's a lot of work that goes into the study. You might even do it a couple times. So you might do it with a small set of users, and then when things don't go quite right, then you tweak it or things like that. But basically every interaction, everything you show them, the order that you show it into them, even every word that you say to them is usually pre-thought out. So the things that you say to the participant, you don't want to give one participant a whole bunch of information and then a different participant different information or less information, because that could bias the results as well. So usually what you would do is you would write down actually exactly what you want to say and you would read it. It's kind of awkward, but basically you just read off a clipboard and you give them the instructions so everyone gets the same instructions. Now they might ask you questions that force you to go off script. That's fine. You just sort of plan ahead like what you're going to say for what questions you might get. So as I mentioned, you might do a small pilot study first, like with 5 users or something like that. Just not because you care about the results, because you care about the study and how much you can get out of someone in an hour and how smoothly it goes and what are some unexpected issues and things like that. And then you'll do the real study itself. Okay, now there's different ways of doing a study as well. So it again depends on what you're doing, but a lot of studies are, it's hard to just say like, here's software, is it usable? That's like a really hard thing to say, okay? Because usability is kind of vague and you're not really sure about it, okay? A thing that's a lot easier and sort of more scientific would be, here's system A and here's system B, which is more usable, okay? So is A usable, is B usable? I don't know, but B is more usable than A. Okay, that's a lot easier. And it's also very natural. Like, for example, you might have existing software, you have some new updates, then that's fine. You compare, you say, does the new version of the software, is it actually more usable than the old version? So that's inherently a comparison. Or you have competitors, right? So I have my security software. I think it's very usable. We put a lot of effort into the usability of it. So here's the competitor product. Let's bring users in and see which one's more usable. So anyway, so a lot of these user studies end up being comparisons between variants, and then it's a lot easier to do a comparison than trying to establish something for itself. Okay. Now, when you compare two things, the most common study design is called between subjects, and so okay, I'll give you a sort of example first before I define what it means. So let's say that we have two systems, we want to compare them A and B, all right? So what I do is I get 20 users, I bring them in, and the first user comes in, I say, okay, I have 60 minutes with you, so for the first 30 minutes, we're going to use system A, and then the second 30 minutes, we'll use system B. So I get them to do some tasks on system A, then I get them to do maybe the same task on system B, and then at the end, we sort of talk about which one's more usable, okay? So is there any issue with that kind of design that you can think of? Okay, let me ask it a different way. Let's say I do A before B. Does that matter? If I did B before A, would that make a difference?
Yes, because the user can be tired.
Okay. So it seems to make a big difference. So there's two things. One is the user might be fatigued by the time they use the second one, so you might get worse results. The other is that they learn something. So by using system A, like they don't know anything about the software, they've at least used that category of software at least once now because they use system A for 30 minutes. Then when they use system B, they're going to be a little faster. They kind of know what's happening. And so we call that the learnability effect. So they learn something by doing A before B. And that will bias your results, okay? So there's two ways around it. One that's considered the gold standard, and then there's kind of a lazy way of doing it. The lazy way would be you could randomize it. So some do A and then B, and then some do B instead of A. But a much better, more robust way of doing it is you actually split your users in half. Half of them only use A and they never see B, and the other half use B and they never see A. Then you have there's no crossover effects between them at all.
But how they compare if they only
So they don't compare. So they don't do the comparison themselves, right? So we'll talk about how you get the data that's out. So you want to extract a comparison between them. But like, for example, say you use system A, so I'll just say how usable was A, and you'll say blah, 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 blah. And then I'll ask someone else that did system B, and I'll say how usable was B. Then what I'm comparing is their answers, and I'm trying to see whether the people who use B think it's more useful than the people who do A. Yeah, so it's a more of an indirect approach. But anyways, you'll see very concretely how to do it and put a number on it. Okay, so you split them into two groups. First group will only use A, never B. The other one will use B only. And sometimes this is called A/B testing as well. That's another term for it. And the other thing is, okay, now you have two groups. How do you figure out which one's using the old version and who's using the new version, right? Do you put all your really smart users in, they all use the new version and everyone else uses the old version? You can't do that, right? That's going to bias the results as well. So there's two ways, again, of doing it. The easiest way to do is random. So you roll a dice, flip a coin, and then you give them A, B. And then if you have a big enough group, any differences will average out, okay? So there could indeed be biases, okay? And later you'll try and figure out what's the probability that A did better than B because of the random assignment just happened to have more experts in group B than A, and you can try and put some numbers on that. And there's some standard statistical tests for trying to answer that question. But if you have a really small group, or maybe you have a weird demographic, or you have trouble attracting users that match your demographic, then you might do like a weighted kind of approach where you might say, okay, I have 3 users that look like this. I'm going to make sure that they don't all go in the same group. I'm going to actually like distribute them. And so as long as you are transparent about how you did it, then people will read it and they'll decide whether they agree with it or not. But anyways, you can statistically like sort of assign people, but the best way is just to do it randomly, get enough users so that all the differences cancel out. Yeah.
Going back to the reliability bias.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that there'll be bias basically if the person already use system A, then you now use system B afterwards. But thinking about it, wouldn't it be better in the sense that since they already know what system B is, when they're evaluating system A, they can see the differences and they can tell you the differences in system A and system B. But then what if we randomize it then? So half of a group will do system A and system B, while the next group will do system B and system A. So at least there's going to be this kind of correlation because they already know system A and they
Right.
want that system B. Would that be better?
Yeah, yeah. So if you randomize it, so half of them do A, B, half of them do B, A. So that is better. It averages out the learnability bias. So the learnability of system A and B will be equivalent. There's still learnability there. It's just that you've equalized it. So it's absolutely true. The worst thing you could do is everyone does A and everyone does B. Okay? Now, you might decide that the learnability bias is so strong that basically every user that used that second, like once you go to the second one, it kind of becomes useless, right? So then you might say, I'm only going to consider the first half of every interaction. So half the users used A first. I consider their first half. That's sort of pristine. And then half the users use B. I consider the first half. But that's actually exactly what this is. That's just saying use A and use B, right? So then the only answer is, do you want to try to, you could throw away half of your data if it gets bad, right? But you would actually have it there. Or the other thing is between subjects is you now have a full hour to use A, right? As opposed to having half an hour to use A and then half an hour using B, but you might throw away B as well. And so I think most people prefer to use that same hour as well. Now, the con of it, as you both of you mentioned, is that you can't ask the user a direct question of what do you prefer between A and B. You use both of them, what do you think between them? So you have to establish what the differences are indirectly, right? And so if there were no good ways of doing that, then we would probably prefer to try and deal with learnability, but have it. But there actually are pretty good ways of telling the differences, which I'll show you in a second. So it's not really a problem. So then, anyways, those are sort of some answers for why people do it. But people do it the way that you suggest as well. So it's not, I'm not saying 100% of people do it this way, but this is sort of the preferred approach.
Professor, respecting the idea of not paying anyway the user even if they didn't finish. I've seen some studies where they pay at the end, but to avoid the fact that the user start clicking anything, they put some questions in the middle that check if the user is really doing the right thing. For example, they ask the date of birth in the middle.
Right.
So if someone is just clicking and the answer is wrong, they eliminate that record. That works?
Yes, yeah. So it is another way. Again, you're eliminating the lazy student, right, who wants to get out of there. But there's also the person who's sitting there that they want to get paid anyways. So they'll do it they'll see their birth date, they'll put it in. Like they're putting a minimal amount of effort. So you're not going to catch that kind of student. So it's better to just let them drop out and pay them. But that type of thing is exactly correct. And we still, basically the best approach is to do both. Okay? So you should do both where you try to make sure that people are paying attention. So you have these attention checkers. And at the same time, you also give them the option of leaving if they want to. So so the correct answer actually is to do both. Yeah. And I'll show you some examples of what you described also that's coming up. Yeah. Okay. All right, so then now we've done our user study, users are done, so we have something to look at. Now we have to decide, okay, what's more usable, system A or system B? So we have a bunch of transcripts of what happened, and we have maybe the software's instrumentation so we could see what people clicked on and all of that type of stuff. Now we have to say something concrete about it. So how do we analyze it? So during the study, we're going to collect some data. It could be observations of the person running the study. It could be the software collects it itself. You could videotape it. Any questionnaire or something you give to the user will be recorded, so you'll have that data. And the data that you want is usually, well, it's going to be one of two things. It's either going to be a number or it's going to be not a number. Sorry, let me rephrase it. What you would like to have actually is numbers. If you had numbers, it's concrete, it's easy to say things scientific about numbers. Okay, so that's what you want. The problem is the data that you collect isn't going to necessarily be numbers. So some data that you collect will be in the form of a number, and some of it will not be number. Okay, so how usable a software isn't really a number, right? How long did it take you to complete this task in milliseconds? That's a number. You can put a number on it. Okay, so unfortunately for usability, the things that you're interested in tend to be non-numbers. They tend to be qualitative data as opposed to quantitative data. So we need to do something about that. So quantitative would be users complete the task 7 seconds faster on system B. And notice you can, even if users use A and some users use B, you can tell which one did it. Like, you don't have to have the same user use both systems to make a statement like this, okay? You have a bunch of users that did it in A, you measure the time, you average it out. A bunch of people did it on B, you average it out, and then you can say, okay, there's a 7-second difference when they use system B. You can say, okay, how many errors did the user commit, right? And so you could say, well, when they use system A, on average, it was 18, this slide's kind of weird. It shouldn't be a percentage. But anyways, let's say it's 18 errors and 4 errors on system B. Then you could say, okay, do users like system A better than like system B? And now it's not like a number. It's not 7 seconds. It's not like 18 errors. It's sort of a qualitative thing. Like, I kind of like this one better or whatever. Okay, so here's the $1 million question is, let's say you want to collect a bunch of qualitative statements, like users liked the data, they felt secure using it, they felt it was offering security features, they felt it was easy to use, they liked the interface. These are all qualitative things, okay? But you want a number because when you write your report, you want to say this is 18% better or whatever. So the question is, is there a way to convert qualitative data into numbers? So how?
There are many ways. You can
just give me one.
Yeah.
One.
Sorry. You can pre-build some. It's like your example, for example. You can do a table and levels of like, for example, if you really like medium, like low, and assign a number with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. And someone else had questionnaire, they're maybe thinking the same thing. Okay, so the way that you do it is exactly that. It's something that we've all seen in this room. You might not know that it's so standard that it actually has a name. So it's called the Likert scale. And so it's this thing, right? You make a statement, it's a qualitative statement. This website has a user-friendly interface. And then people say, I agree, I strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And then you give it a number. Okay, so it's a +2 for strongly agree, it's a -2 for strongly disagree, a 0 for neutral, 1 for -1 for agree, disagree. Okay, then you can actually ask them qualitative kinds of questions. They answer, you can convert those answers into numbers, and then you can say, in system A, the average came out to 1.5, and in system B, it came out to a 1.8, which shows that people in system B agreed more strongly with the statement that the website has a user interface with B than A. Okay, so then you can put a hard number on it, and so this is why these things are so popular. They're kind of annoying to fill out, but that's what the people are trying to do. Is they have some qualitative thing that they're measuring, and they want to turn it into a number so they can say something concrete about it. Okay. So there's two problems with these. Okay, one problem is I get tired halfway through, and so I stop paying attention and I just start randomly answering things, or I just say I agree, or I strongly agree all the way down. Okay, so then this goes back to your earlier point. What do you do about that? Okay, do you throw it away when you see I disagree all the way down? Like how do you? And if they fatigue, maybe they're just not paying close attention. So they're still varying their answers. So if you look mathematically at it, it sort of looks like an average response, but the person just doesn't care. They're kind of checked out. So they're not paying attention. So is there anything you could do to combat that?
Can you swap? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll go.
Check. One of them is a checking question, like you put into specifically ask choose neutral or I agree.
Okay. So you could build into the question what the response should be.
They are paying attention.
Okay, so that would be a way of doing it. That works, sure.
You can swap the scale in the middle, and also you can study as like a distribution and discard the extreme.
Okay, so you could throw out outliers. You could try messing around with the scale just to keep things fresh. Although if you mess with the scale, if I'm sort of answering erratically, you wouldn't necessarily be able to sort it out. But let's play with that idea a bit more. So what people will do is they'll actually ask the exact same question, but they'll ask it in the opposite way. So for example, question 1 will be the website has a user-friendly interface. And let's say I put I agree, right? Then like buried in the middle, like question 26, it will say the website does not have a user-friendly interface. Now, if I said I agreed with the first statement, then I should disagree with the second. If I agree with both of them, that's a contradiction, okay? If I strongly agree, but only disagree, not strongly disagree, that's like a light contradiction. Maybe I just sort of forgot, or like it doesn't mean a lot, the difference between them. But that's the kind of question. So one thing when you take these things in the future, you might notice it might frustrate you that sometimes you feel like they ask you the same question more than once. Like I've already answered that question. That's actually deliberate. So they're doing it on purpose and they're checking it. Another thing you can do, it goes back to like, do you do A, B, or BA? You could randomize it. Same with this. You should randomize the question. So if question 1 is always the website has a user-friendly interface, a new user, they're going to spend a lot of time thinking about that question because it's the first one, right? Question 5 or question 50, they're going to spend a lot less time on, okay? So if you randomize the order of the questions, then every question has a shot at being near the top of the pile for at least one of your users, so they'll actually give some consideration to it. So that the randomization combats user fatigue, and then those kind of checks where you check for consistency by asking the same question twice, phrased differently, that can kind of resolve the I disagree all the way down problem. You can also try and shorten it too. So you have to acknowledge that someone doesn't want, I get these from the university all the time, and sometimes they're like, I don't know, like 10 pages of 20 questions, like 50 questions or something like that, and I just stop after, I give them 20 questions and then I stop or whatever. You can randomize the order, consistency checks. Okay, now we got our Likert scale questions and we got our data, we've measured the times and all that things. So now we want to say something concrete about the data itself. And so here you would use some statistical analysis. So you break things into percentages and I'm not going to go through, A, I'm not an expert in statistics. B, you actually have to be an expert. So it's not the kind of thing where you can just pick up a text, read Wikipedia, what a t-test is, and then go do a user study and do it right. Like the people that do this, they know statistics, they know what it's exactly telling you, what it's not telling you, and things like that. So that's not my expertise. But in general, what I understand the process to be is you sort of write down a hypothesis, like system A is more usable than system B. So that's a hypothesis. And you want to either prove or disprove it. So it might be the opposite. That's fine. You'll still get evidence that it's the opposite, which would disprove it. The problem is that when you put people into groups A and B, it might be that group A is, they have more expertise, and so they're thinking that A is more usable than B when it's actually not. Okay, so even though you have a measurable difference where more people agree with the statement that this system is usable in group A than in group B, it's just down to the random chance of how you assigned people into the group. Okay, so what the statistics will do is they'll give you a test that basically says, okay, what's the probability that the effect that you're seeing is real versus it being the result of a random chance? And there's ways to decrease that probability. The best way to do it is crank up the number of users. Okay, so if you go from 20 to 30 users to 40 users, the probability of any effect being due to random chance goes down. I want to say exponentially. I don't know if it's exactly exponentially, but it goes down over time. And then it also depends on how subtle the effect is. Okay, if it's a big difference, right, you might only need 5 users or 10 users to establish that big difference. I mean, it's just so different. Like, everyone strongly disagrees that A is usable, and everyone strongly agrees that system B is usable, right? Like, it's a real strong difference. Then you might get like a lot of confidence that the result is real with less users. But if it's a very subtle thing where the two systems are very, very close, right, that's where you tend to have to use a lot of users, or you might not be confident in the end. So you write down your hypothesis, and these are sort of the options that you have. So the hypothesis looks true, and it's more likely true than random chance. It could be that the hypothesis looks false, meaning the opposite is true, so like B is more usable than A. And further, it's more likely false than due to random choice. And the third option is where you're in the middle, where you can't decide anything. So you say, the hypothesis, the statistics are telling me it looks true, it looks more true than not, or it looks more false than not, but it's still close enough that it could be due to random chance. I can't rule out the idea that it's due to random chance alone. Okay? And so these are the three sort of camps. So in the first two, you've done your job, you've proven it. It's a question of how you phrase your hypothesis. You can always phrase it the most opposite way. And then in the third case, it's sort of like either there's nothing there, like A and B are equal in terms of what you're measuring, or you need to run a lot of more users or something like that, or change your study to try and measure that difference. So in statistics, we call this significance. There's also something called a p-test, which is, it's more or less what this says. And so there's a certain confidence interval, and I'm kind of messing up because I'm not strong on statistics. But anyways, you do this sort of test. It gives you this p-value, and if the p-value threshold to 95% or something says it's greater than 0.05% or something like that, it tells you you're in case 1 and 2 as opposed to case 3, more or less. Okay. But anyways, at my kind of dumb level of understanding of statistics, 20 participants, you can get statistical significance with about 20 participants if what you're measuring has a large effect. And if it has a smaller effect, you might need more like 200 participants in order to get significance. You also have to be careful. There's actually a lot of literature now, because there's all these tests that people ran in like the 1970s and the 1980s or earlier. And they had all these like super counterintuitive, but like kind of interesting like results. Not in security, I should mention. These are like more like general psychology. So for example, one that I remember is they would bring people into the room and they would just talk to them for 5 minutes. And for half of them, they would talk about, like, I might have this wrong, but they would talk sort of like about aging and like the process of aging and how your body breaks down and things like that. And then the other half, they would talk about like being young and athletic and things like that. And then what they would do is the participant would leave, and then they would measure how long does it take them to walk from the one end to the hallway to the other. And the effect was that if you talk to people about aging, they walk slower. And if you talk about being like young and athletic and things like that, then they walk faster. So I really thought that was interesting, and it was like the kind of thing you would tell at parties and things like that. But the problem is that when people reran it, they couldn't get that effect. Okay, so the statistics were probably right, But what you can do is you can tweak things, or you can drop participants or not drop participants, or you can have 10 hypotheses and 9 of them you don't get significance, but the one that you do, that's the one that you publish a paper about, and things like that. So they call it p-value hacking. So there's different ways of sort of manipulating your study so that you get statistical significance. But then what happens is when people try to replicate it, so that's considered the gold standard. Is if lots of people replicate it in lots of different settings and the study's slightly different, but the effect is always the same, then that looks really like that effect is real. But anyways, there's a whole bunch of these like very famous studies that people have failed to replicate, and so it's sort of down to like how you play around with your statistics. Okay, so statistical analysis requires expertise, and okay. So the pros and cons I'll go through in a second, but we're kind of overdue for a break. So why don't we go away for 10 minutes and come back around quarter after, and then I'll go through the rest. Okay, so we saw the user study now. We saw the cognitive walkthrough. We'll consider now which one's better. So if I want to decide between a cognitive walkthrough, a user study, or a field study where we're going, then we can do the pros and cons. So the main advantage of a user study is that the people you bring in are actually using the system, and they're telling you, you're learning from the actual people that will eventually use your system, assuming your system is meant to be used by the average person. But you can always change the demographic of people that you draw in, okay? But there are some cons to it. Okay, so the first is that normal people might not be your actual user group, like I say. So you might have an expert tool that's actually meant by experts, but in your user study you have a bunch of normal people. There's only so much you can cover in 30 or 60 minutes, especially if they're using it for the first time, especially if you're going to ask them a bunch of questions about it. You're going to really make sure you understand what they're doing, so they're doing it slowly. They're being careful about what they do because they know it's a laboratory setting. So you're not going to get a lot out of them in 30 to 60 minutes. You can always do follow-up studies and things like that. But anyways, at a certain point, it kind of turns into a field study anyways. The next thing is you can think about the way users behave. Like they come into a lab, they come all the way to Concordia, they're sitting, someone's standing with a clipboard, they're watching every little thing they do. Are they going to behave exactly as they would behave at home if they were just using their computer and no one was watching? Probably not, right? They're going to be a lot more careful about what they do. They're going to think about what they're being asked to do, and they're going to put more deliberation into things, okay? So that can create bias. So that's called ecological validity. Ecological meaning the setting of the study could make the validity of the results questionable, or there could be some kind of bias there. User studies, especially compared to expert review, they take a lot of work. You have to get ethics, you have to try the study, maybe a pilot, you have to work out every detail of everything. You have to do all the data analysis at the end and things like that. So they are, they're sort of something that takes a lot of time. You also have to sit. If you have 20 users for an hour, that's 20 hours. 20 hours where you're just sitting there, and some of them aren't going to show up and things like that. And so you're going to block off time in your calendar. And I've been involved in these like in a university setting, and the person that actually has to sit and go through the study with the user, it's a lot of time when you add it up. And then this was a point that was raised earlier as well, is you bring the user in for 30 minutes or 60 minutes. Okay, so they think it's usable in that 30 minutes, but now they've used it for a week, they've used it for 2 weeks, they've used it for a month. Does their attitude change? Or things that they thought were difficult, do they become easier because they've used it because of repetition? Things that like you're giving a lot of guidance to the user, so they think that's really good for 30 minutes, but after a week they're really sick of it and they fatigue on it, right? And so those sort of longer term effects, those are things that you don't really pick up in a user study because you only have 30, 60 minutes. So I'll give you an example. This is actually a video. I forgot I had a video for it. Let me see if I can play the sound. It's a very trivial video, but anyways, since I have it, I might as well at least try to play it. plenty loud. Okay, again, this has nothing to do with security, but it's just something to illustrate the point.
Pepsi versus Coke, the Pepsi Challenge. And all across America, more people pick Pepsi time after time.
So I promise this has something to do with security. It's not just trying to get you thirsty. Okay, so this is a sort of campaign that Pepsi did. So this is the soft drink. And so they had this idea of, they called it the Pepsi Challenge. And so the idea would be you would go into a grocery store, Pepsi would pay for someone to be there, and they would give you basically a user study, like a blind taste test. So they would pour Coke into one glass, they would pour Pepsi into another glass. They would mix them up so you didn't know which one was which. And then you would taste both of them and you would say, I like A better than B, or I like B better than A. And then what they found is they found that, lo and behold, lots of people prefer Pepsi over Coke. Okay, so more people were going home with Pepsi than were going home with Coke. Okay, so Coke, they saw this, and it went on for like months and a year, and it actually like cut into their profits. It was a very successful campaign, and there were commercials about it and things like that. And so what Coke did is they said, okay, we kind of know why. We have an idea of why this is happening. We think it's happening basically because Pepsi is sweeter than Coke. So you drink Pepsi, and it tastes better in that kind of setting, of you're in a grocery store and you're drinking two of them, and so we're not sure. So what we're going to do is we're going to reformulate how we make Coke. We're going to change the recipe for Coke. So what they did is and because they know the methodology is you give users two of them. They would tweak the recipe, they would try something, and then they would do a user study. They would bring people in. This is all secret, okay? So they would bring people in, they would give them the new Coke and the original Pepsi, and they would say, which do you like better? And then they kept tweaking it until they had a winner, which they felt like, okay, this is something that most people, like when we do the user studies internally, everyone says they like the new Coke better than Pepsi, and so we're going to beat Pepsi at their own game. Okay, so they actually released it. They came out with it. It was called Coke as opposed to Coca-Cola. It's also called New Coke, is what people call it. Controversially, they got rid of Coca-Cola. So this was a replacement. It's not just like now they have like new, like there's Coke Zero, but they also have Diet Coke and they also have normal Coke. Like it wasn't like just there's a new kind of Coke. Sorry, excuse me. I'm getting excited about this. It's an actual upgrade. Okay, so this is a replacement to the existing product. Okay, so they released it, and then they did the same campaign that Pepsi did. So they went into grocery stores now. They set up booths. They did the exact same experiment. And lo and behold, it worked. Okay, people said, actually, we like this new Coke better. It was even sweeter than Pepsi. It was kind of citrusy, so it tasted a little bit different. And so they were very happy. They said, okay, we beat Pepsi at their own game. Okay. Now there was one problem with it. All right. So the problem is that it's true that people went in, they had a sip of the new Coke and they liked it better than Pepsi. Then a lot of them would say, okay, give me a case of the new Coke. They would go home, and all of a sudden they drink 1, 2, 3 cans of it, and they'd say, actually, you know what? The things that like were interesting about it at first, like how sweet it was and the citrusy, it kind of tastes gross. Like now that I drink like half a can or a full can, it kind of tastes like cough syrup. Not really crazy about it. Actually, we don't like it. And then there's all the people who like the original Coke, right? And they were mad because Coke got rid of the original Coke and replaced it with this. And there was a huge backlash. So everyone decided they actually hate this new Coke, even though it outperformed Pepsi in the Pepsi Challenge. People, they disliked it. Okay, and so the lesson is that in a small amount, it tastes good. So if you have a sip of it, it tastes good, but you don't just sip Coke, right? You're going to drink a can of it at least. You might drink multiple cans, and and your profile changes the more you use it. Okay. So what's the lesson for software usability? Usability is kind of like that, okay? There's things that you can do, and you bring a user in for 30 minutes, it's like they're getting a sip of your software, okay? And they may really like it, right? But then once they have to use it for a day, a week, a month, they might decide, actually, those things that we thought we liked because we were sipping it, we now hate. They're really annoying. So another example that's not security specific, but is software specific. Oh yeah, and by the way, this is from this book, Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. Is this thing, I don't know if some people are laughing. Some of you are probably too young to know what it is, although it's come back in memes. But Microsoft Word, the most popular word processor, they decided at some point that they were going to add an animated character that is called Clippy. And they'll always be on. So every time you open the software, it's there. At first, there was no way to turn it off. Eventually, they made it so you could turn it off, and then Then eventually they got rid of it entirely. But basically, it was actually there for a usability purpose. It would say, oh, it looks like you're trying to create a new document. Do you want me to show you how? Right? Now, I don't know the backstory of this, but from what I know about usability, is I imagine that Microsoft, they test everything. So they probably ran a lot of user studies. They tested this out. People came in for 30 minutes and said, that's really useful, right? I like them, like I have no idea how to do something with the software. It's really complicated. It's a word processor. This thing is telling me what I want to do. It's anticipating what I want to do. It's telling me I love it, right? That's awesome. And then Microsoft got really excited and they put it out. And people also maybe had the same reaction when they used Word for the first 5 times, right? But now imagine, I don't know, you're a journalist and you use Word every single day, and it's been 3 weeks, and this thing is not just like, it's not just pops up, it like dances around and does all sorts of things, and you're getting really annoyed with it, right? Like you're fatigued on that idea, okay? So this idea of like, it sort of over-helped the user. It went too far in helping and guiding the user. That's generally a good principle. We look for the interface to guide you. This is actually a very explicit example of the user interface is guiding you, okay? So this is generally good, but you do it too much, and then users, they don't like it after a while, okay? User studies not going to pick this up. In fact, it might actually lead you to do exactly the wrong thing, right? Because they're only getting a sip of it, the sip is dangerous because it's enough to think that they have an opinion, even though it's the exact opposite opinion to what they'll have if they drank a can of it. So anyway, so this is sort of a warning against user studies.
Professor, this is a very good example of because they tested with people who are new to Word, but in reality, the base of users were Word users, so
right.
They really didn't need this, but they tested with new users, so it looks perfect. But when someone who has been using Word for years, it's a joke.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so that's another kind of bias that could have crept in to the user study too. Is the user group that they drew in were new users, but their actual base it was a different demographic as well. Yeah. Okay, so you're going to miss long-term issues like fatigue and habituation. All right, then the final thing is, okay, can you correct that? And so the answer is you could. So the best way to correct it is a field study. Field studies are great. They're kind of the gold standard for usability, but they're also expensive and they're hard to do. It's hard to get permission to do them. So the idea of a field study is that you have your new system. You're just going to give it to the actual users that are using the old system. Okay, you'll deploy it. Maybe you'll still do A/B groups. So you'll have group A, they use the old system. In parallel, you give it to half of the users to use the new one. And then you'll automate the system as well, so it will do data collection and things like that automatically. So here's an example that was interesting. So these are some researchers that are in Montreal at Polytechnique and some at Carleton in Ottawa. And so they did a study where they were interested in basically how do users actually end up with malware? Like what kind of websites are they going on? How do they get malware? What do they do when they get malware? How effective are the malware tools and things like that? And so these are things that you could study a little bit, like in pieces if you did 30, 60-minute user interviews. But what they decided instead is we want to do a field study. And so their idea was actually very brilliant, is they said, we're going to actually give people a laptop. So we'll say, you get a laptop, it's free. We're doing some studies. We're not going to tell you, again, deception. I don't know what they said exactly, but they didn't really tell them why they were interested in it. But they just said, look, you get the laptop. It's actually yours. You can do whatever you want with it. But we are doing a user study, and we're going to collect data for the first year that you have this laptop, or first 4 years or whatever. And then at the end of the study, you keep the laptop. It's yours, kind of thing. Okay? So then they just sat back and they said, okay, some of these people are going to end up with malware, all right? And we're just going to see how that happened, right? And we're going to see what they do and what their response is and things like that. And under the operating system, there was some instrumentation of it, so it would collect data automatically and things like that. And they would bring the laptop in, I think, once a month or something for maintenance, and they would kind of grab stuff off of it and things like that. But anyways, and then there's obviously lots of privacy considerations, right? Like you can't know every website that every user is going to. You can't like screen grab everything. You can't grab their bank details or their passwords and things like that. And so then it also has to be very careful in order to observe, to respect the privacy of the user, but still get the data that's useful for malware. So anyways, that's an example that I thought was interesting. But then companies will also do it like where they'll just they'll deploy it amongst their users internally, the different systems. So this is like the between studies basically version of it. So this is where you're more likely to see the term A/B test, but it means basically the same thing as between studies, which is that you give half of your users A, you give half of them B, and then you just sit back and see what happens. What's the difference between A and B? You assign them to groups randomly. And then another thing that's common, and it depends exactly what you're doing, but A/B testing is also used to be able to evolve your ideas. So for example, it's used a lot in advertising. And Google, if you buy AdWords from Google, they'll automate this for you. So they'll say, hey, you want to do A/B testing? That's great. Give us 2 wordings of your ad that are slightly, well, as different as you want them to be. So you might use like one word that's different, and then they'll run it, they'll just randomly, like someone clicks on the right thing so that they're going to be shown one of your 2 ads. Google will flip a coin and either show them A or they'll show them B. And then after a couple weeks, they'll come back to you and say, okay, this many people clicked, 52% clicked when like the learn more button was blue, but when you turned it to green, 72% people clicked through it, or whatever the case is. Okay, so you get all this data and then you can tweak it. Okay, so field studies are very good in terms of ecological validity. Ecological validity, remember, it means like when you bring a user into the lab and you're looking over the shoulder with a clipboard, they're going to behave differently. With a field study, at first, like it's a new system, they maybe kind of vaguely know that people are watching what they're doing with it. They might behave differently, but after a day or a week or a month, they've forgotten about it. They don't even remember anymore, and they're just using it, right? And so you're getting pretty strong validity because they're actually using it in the setting that they're meant to use it. Your users are your actual users. So as long as you randomly assign them between A and B, they're almost statistically identical to your target user. Depends on your organization, but you could have thousands of employees that test the system. If you're a website, you could have millions or more. And so any like subtle effect, like the difference between a green and blue button, you run 10,000 people through it, you can tell the difference between those 2 things, right? You run 20 people through, you're probably not going to be able to tell the difference. Also, over the course of a week or a month, your users are going to use almost every aspect of your system at least once. In a user study, you can get them to do maybe 2 or 3 tasks. Depends on how complicated the tasks are. But over a couple months, they'll, like all the obscure menu options or the settings or things like that, like somebody somewhere will tweak that at least at one point across your study. So you get a broad coverage of the software. And then okay, sorry, I had to remind myself what I meant by this. So in the user study, you're also guiding them. So you're saying, I want you to do A, I want you to do B, I want you to do C. Now there's things that users might do that you didn't anticipate that they would do necessarily, but it might become really important to them. It might be part of their work process that they always do this type of thing. And so that's the type of thing that you could pick up in a field study. You could say, hey, like 20% of users, they always do this thing. Like, why is that? And then you figure out why. And then you might say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So maybe I should make that an option in the software. I should make it easier for them to complete this particular task, even though it wasn't one of the tasks that I initially thought users used the software for. So you learn a bit about how users are using your software beyond what your guess is as to how they use it. The drawbacks, why don't we just do field studies? They're awesome. A question? Yeah.
When you're recruiting the users for the field studies, is it the same method of recruitment you use for the user case study?
Yeah, so you could, so in a user study, there's basically let's boil it down to three things. There's recruitment. So here it's usually solved for you, right? So they're already your employees or whatever, so you don't have to explicitly recruit them. The second thing you do is the pre-question error, which is to get their demographic information. You may or may not do that in this case. So you might get them to fill out a survey first, so you can figure out like kind of how much expertise they have and things like that. Or you might assume that because they're already your users, then they're the right demographic, so we don't need to measure it. But you probably would want to get their demographic information as well. And then you just randomly assign A to B. So the assignment is random at that point. So that's the same as a user study, more or less. Cool. Other questions, comments? Okay, so why don't we just do field studies all the time? They're better. They're super expensive, right? You have to convince a company to do it. You have to get your software working exactly correct. You have to instrument it to collect all the data. And the big problem with it is, let's say you screw it up. You're a usability person or whatever, and so you think all these changes are good. So you do like some software that incorporates them, right? But now people are using it for their job, and say you introduce bugs in the software because of the changes you made. You're just trying to change the user interface, but there's a bunch of bugs now. And now it's taking everyone way longer to do their tasks. You're actually affecting your business, right? You're affecting the bottom line. The company's losing money because you're running your little experiment because you have all these bugs in your software because you're just trying to measure usability or whatever. So when you do your second system and you want to test it, it needs to be highly polished and it needs to run like exactly the same as the other one. Otherwise, you're going to lose productivity and you'll lose money in the end. Okay, so the example I want to give of the unexpected task completion is, this is again an analogy that has nothing to do with security, but I kind of like it. Okay, so you can see here there's a bunch of grass. In the middle, there's a kind of dirt path. Why is there a dirt path there? Okay, people walk there. Okay, why are they walking across there? Because it's a shortcut, right? It's useful to them. It's the quickest way to get to the building, right? Okay. Why isn't there a sidewalk there? It's the shortest way to the building. Why is there not a sidewalk? Because someone was given the job of putting in sidewalks, and they said, I think I know how users walk. Users want to walk along here, and then they want to walk along here. And they made a mistake. They were wrong. Right? Users don't want to walk, across here and across here. They want to cut across the diagonal, right? Okay. Now, this is actually very useful if you design software and you do a field study and you see this type of thing in the software equivalent, because this tells you there should be a sidewalk there. Okay? People don't like your sidewalk. They made their own sidewalk. Okay? And what you should do is you should put a sidewalk there. Okay, so I'm speaking at an analogy level, but if users are using your software different than how you designed it, and you see a lot of people doing the same thing over and over, then you should enshrine that in the software, and you should try to, make that process easier, because that's how they're actually using the system. Okay, so it's okay, like if you get sidewalks wrong at first, that's all right, but you need to be able to react to being wrong and fix it. Then you can actually build something. So getting a lot of users just to use your system and use it for 3 months, you get all sorts of useful data about like how people use it and what they actually want from your software, and it could be completely different than what you think they want. So anyways, that's called a wear path, by the way. That's the technical name for it. Okay, now the other thing I'll mention is that you don't have to choose necessarily between all of them, right? You can also do all of them, okay? And most people will actually do all three. So they'll start with a cognitive walkthrough, they'll hire an expert, they'll learn as much as they can. The cognitive walkthrough will tell them sort of points where maybe they need some user testing, right? These points we're not so sure about whether these are usable, or these seem to be the trouble spot. Then they'll design a user study around those trouble spots, right? They'll run a couple user studies, they'll try and iron it out, they'll try and make the system as good as possible. And then when the expert's happy, when the users are doing well and performing well on it, then they might say, well, now it's ready for a field study. Now we'll actually deploy it and we'll learn for real how usable the system actually is. Okay, so that's it. So that's the theory of usability. So as mentioned, next class, I'll give you an example. We'll do the cognitive walkthrough together. We'll do it on Tor, so I'll tell you a bit about what Tor is, how it works, and then we'll do the actual walkthrough. And then for your second assignment, you'll do a walkthrough as well. Okay, questions? All right, so I'll see you all next week.